Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, 184–205 CE. Now buckle up as we begin. In the dying years of the 2nd century CE, the mighty Han Dynasty that had ruled China for over 3 centuries was rotting from within. Emperor Ling sat upon the dragon throne, but real power lay in the hands of corrupt eunuchs who sold government positions to the highest bidders. Meanwhile, across the empire's vast territories, common people suffered under crushing taxation, devastating floods along the Yellow River, and widespread famine. It was into this world of despair that a charismatic faith healer named Zhang Jue emerged, preaching a revolutionary message that would shake the foundations of Imperial China and ultimately contribute to the fall of one of history's greatest dynasties. Zhang Jue was no ordinary rebel. Born into humble circumstances, he had studied the ancient arts of medicine and the mystical teachings of the Taiping Tao, or Way of Great Peace. This syncretic religion combined elements of Taoism with folk beliefs and promised salvation to the downtrodden masses. Zhang Jue proclaimed himself the great teacher and claimed divine powers, asserting that he could heal the sick through prayer and ritual. His message was revolutionary. The corrupt Han Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, and a new golden age was coming where the yellow sky would replace the blue sky, symbolizing the rise of the common people over the aristocracy. Word of this miracle worker spread like wildfire across the countryside. Desperate peasants, ravaged by years of natural disasters and government exploitation, flocked to hear Zhang Jue preach. His followers adopted yellow headbands as their symbol, earning them the name Yellow Turbans. Zhang Jue was not content to work alone in this monumental undertaking. He recruited his 2 younger brothers, Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang, as his chief lieutenants, creating a family dynasty to lead the coming revolution. The 3 brothers divided their growing movement into a sophisticated organizational structure. Zhang Jue established 36 fang, or districts, across 8 provinces of the empire. Each district was led by a trusted commander who reported directly to one of the Zhang brothers. The largest districts commanded over 10,000 followers, while smaller ones controlled 6,000 to 7,000 adherents. This network allowed the rebels to coordinate activities across vast distances and maintain communication through a system of coded messages and secret symbols. The brothers spent years building their organization in secret, training followers in both military tactics and religious doctrine. They stockpiled weapons, established supply lines, and created a shadow government ready to replace imperial authority when the moment came to strike. By 184 CE, the Yellow Turban movement had grown into a colossal underground network encompassing hundreds of thousands of followers. The organization had penetrated deep into the heart of the empire, with cells operating even in the imperial capital. Zhang Jue's disciples had infiltrated government offices, military units, and merchant guilds. The time for revolution had arrived, and Zhang Jue issued secret orders for a coordinated uprising to begin on the 5th day of the 3rd lunar month. The plan was audacious in its scope. Simultaneous attacks across 8 provinces would overwhelm imperial forces and prevent coordinated resistance. Yellow Turban armies would seize key cities, capture government arsenals, and eliminate local officials. Meanwhile, sympathizers within the capital would open the gates and assassinate key imperial ministers. However, fate intervened when a nervous follower named Zhang Jue betrayed the conspiracy to imperial authorities. Racing against time, Zhang Jue was forced to launch his rebellion earlier than planned, sending out emergency signals to begin the uprising immediately. Despite the premature revelation of their plans, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted with devastating force across the Chinese countryside in the spring of 184 CE. Like a great yellow tide, hundreds of thousands of peasant warriors surged from their hiding places, their distinctive headbands fluttering in the wind as they advanced on imperial strongholds. The rebels struck with coordinated precision despite the rushed timeline. In Jizhu province, Zhang Jue himself led the main force, while his brothers commanded separate armies in Yuzhou and other strategic regions. The imperial government, caught off guard by the scale and organization of the uprising, watched in horror as entire provinces fell to the rebels within days. Local magistrates fled their posts, imperial granaries were seized, and their contents distributed to the hungry masses, and government buildings were put to the torch. The Yellow Turbans proclaimed the dawn of a new era, declaring that the corrupt blue sky of the Han Dynasty had ended, and the righteous yellow sky of the people had begun. Emperor Ling and his court reacted to the crisis with a mixture of panic and determination. The scale of the rebellion was unlike anything the dynasty had faced in generations. Reports flooded in from across the empire, describing entire armies of yellow-clad rebels overwhelming imperial garrisons and proclaiming the end of Han rule. The emperor immediately declared martial law and began mobilizing every available military resource. He recalled veteran generals from frontier duties, conscripted emergency troops from loyal provinces, and offered substantial rewards for the capture of the Zhang brothers. The imperial court also made a crucial decision that would have long-term consequences for the dynasty's future. They granted extraordinary military powers to regional governors and warlords, essentially creating independent armies to combat the rebellion. General He Jin was placed in overall command of imperial forces, while other capable commanders like Liu Zhai, Huangfu Song, and Zhu Jun were dispatched to different theaters of operations. The stage was set for a massive civil war that would determine the fate of China. The initial battles of the rebellion saw stunning Yellow Turban victories that sent shockwaves through the imperial establishment. In Jizhu, Zhang Jue's forces overwhelmed local garrisons and captured several important cities, including parts of the regional capital. The rebels demonstrated surprising military competence, employing tactics that combined their religious fervor with practical battlefield knowledge. They used their intimate knowledge of local terrain to ambush imperial columns, attacked during religious festivals when government forces were unprepared, and employed psychological warfare by claiming divine protection, made them invulnerable to enemy weapons. In Yuzhou province, Zhang Bao led another successful campaign, while Zhang Liang achieved similar victories in his assigned territory. The rebels also scored a major propaganda victory when they captured and publicly executed several corrupt local officials, winning support from populations that had suffered under imperial oppression. These early successes brought tens of thousands of new recruits flocking to join the Yellow Turban cause, swelling their armies to unprecedented size. As news of Yellow Turban victories spread, the rebellion expanded beyond its original boundaries. Copycat uprisings erupted in provinces where Zhang Jue had no direct organization, as local grievances and revolutionary fervor combined with reports of rebel success. The movement's religious message resonated powerfully with populations devastated by natural disasters and imperial neglect. Entire regions declared independence from Han rule, with local leaders adopting yellow headbands and proclaiming allegiance to Zhang Jue's vision of the Great Peace. The rebels established their own governmental structures in captured territories, appointing administrators from among their ranks and implementing radical social policies. They redistributed land from wealthy landowners to poor farmers, opened imperial granaries to feed the hungry, and abolished many of the crushing taxes that had impoverished rural populations. For millions of Chinese peasants, the Yellow Turban Rebellion represented their first taste of social justice and economic relief in generations. However, this expansion also created challenges for rebel leadership, as the movement became increasingly difficult to coordinate across such vast distances. The imperial counterattack began in earnest as veteran generals arrived with reinforced armies to confront the rebellion. Liu Zhai, one of the Han Dynasty's most capable military commanders, was dispatched to Jizhu to deal directly with Zhang Jue and the main Yellow Turban force. Meanwhile, Huangfu Song and Zhu Jun led separate expeditions to other rebel strongholds. These imperial forces brought professional military discipline, superior equipment, and tactical experience that the peasant rebels largely lacked. The first major confrontation came when Liu Zhai's army encountered Zhang Jue's forces near the city of Guangzhou. The battle revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Yellow Turban movement. While the rebels fought with tremendous courage and religious conviction, believing their faith would protect them from harm, they struggled against the coordinated tactics and superior weaponry of professional imperial troops. Lu Zhai employed traditional Chinese military strategies, using cavalry charges, crossbow formations, and siege engines to devastating effect against the less disciplined rebel forces. The tide of war began to shift as imperial victories mounted. Despite initial setbacks, the Yellow Turban forces demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Zhang Jue, recognizing that his peasant armies could not match imperial forces in conventional battles, shifted to guerrilla warfare tactics. The rebels abandoned attempts to hold major cities and instead melted back into the countryside they knew intimately. They established hidden camps in mountains, forests, and marshlands where imperial cavalry could not effectively pursue them. From these bases, Yellow Turban forces launched surprise attacks on supply convoys, isolated garrisons, and imperial administrators. This change in strategy proved highly effective, as the rebels' local knowledge and popular support among rural populations made them nearly impossible to completely eliminate. Zhang Jue also intensified his religious propaganda, claiming that temporary defeats were divine tests of faith and that ultimate victory remained assured. His charismatic leadership and promises of supernatural intervention helped maintain morale among his followers, even as they faced increasingly professional imperial opposition. The rebellion evolved from a conventional uprising into a persistent insurgency that would plague the Han Dynasty for decades. The rebellion's transformation into guerrilla warfare created new challenges for both sides, but also revealed the underlying social tensions that had sparked the uprising. In many regions, local populations actively supported Yellow Turban insurgents, providing food, shelter, and intelligence about imperial troop movements. This popular support reflected the deep resentment rural communities felt toward corrupt officials, crushing taxation, and economic exploitation. Imperial forces found themselves fighting not just organized rebel armies, but an entire social movement that had taken root across multiple provinces. General Lu Zhai attempted to address these underlying grievances through a combination of military action and administrative reform. He replaced corrupt local officials, reduced tax burdens in pacified areas, and offered amnesty to rebels who surrendered voluntarily. However, these moderate policies faced resistance from court eunuchs who profited from the existing corrupt system. Political intrigue in the imperial capital undermined military campaigns, as jealous rivals spread false accusations that Lu Zhai was secretly negotiating with rebels to prolong the war for personal gain. Court intrigue reached a critical point when Lu Zhai was recalled to the capital under false accusations of treason, demonstrating how internal corruption continued to handicap imperial efforts against the rebellion. The eunuch faction, led by Zhang Rang, feared that successful generals might gain too much power and threaten their own influence over the emperor. They convinced Emperor Ling that Lu Zhai's failure to achieve quick victory indicated secret collaboration with the rebels. This disastrous decision removed the most competent commander from the field, just as imperial forces were beginning to gain momentum against Zhang Jue's insurgency. Lu Zhai was replaced by Zhang Jue, a brutal general whose harsh methods and personal ambitions would later prove catastrophic for the dynasty. The recall of Lu Zhai sent shockwaves through the imperial officer corps and demonstrated that political loyalty mattered more than military competence. This episode perfectly illustrated the systemic corruption and incompetence that had originally sparked the Yellow Turban Rebellion. The rebels, meanwhile, interpreted Lu Zhai's downfall as proof that their cause enjoyed divine favor and that internal contradictions would ultimately destroy their enemies. With Lu Zhai's removal, the imperial campaign against Zhang Jue lost much of its strategic coherence, but other generals continued pressing attacks against the remaining Zhang brothers. Huangfu Song achieved a significant victory against Zhang Liang in Yingchuan province, employing a combination of direct assault and psychological warfare. He spread rumors that the Yellow Turban leaders had lost their divine protection, while simultaneously offering generous terms to rebels who abandoned their cause. This strategy proved effective, causing mass desertions from Zhang Liang's army just before the decisive battle. When Imperial forces finally engaged the weakened rebel army, the outcome was catastrophic for the Yellow Turbans. Zhang Liang was killed in the fighting, becoming the first of the three brothers to fall. His death sent shockwaves through the rebel movement, as many followers had believed the Zhang brothers possessed supernatural powers that made them invulnerable. However, rather than ending the rebellion, Zhang Liang's death only intensified the religious fervor of remaining believers, who claimed he had ascended to heaven and would return to lead them to final victory. The death of Zhang Liang marked a turning point in the rebellion, but Zhang Bao continued resistance in his own territory, while his eldest brother Zhang Jue maintained the largest rebel force in Jizhu. Imperial pressure intensified as more professional armies converged on the remaining strongholds. Zhang Bao, perhaps the most militarily capable of the three brothers, adapted his tactics to emphasize mobility and surprise attacks. He divided his forces into smaller, more manageable units that could strike quickly and then disappear into familiar terrain. This approach prolonged the conflict, but gradually wore down both rebel numbers and morale. Meanwhile, the economic cost of the prolonged war was devastating the imperial treasury and disrupting agriculture across multiple provinces. Entire regions lay depopulated and uncultivated as armies marched back and forth, while trade routes remained unsafe for merchants. The rebellion had achieved one of its implicit goals, demonstrating that the Han Dynasty was no longer capable of maintaining effective governance across its vast territories. Even as military campaigns continued, the political and economic foundations of imperial authority were crumbling under the strain of prolonged conflict. As 184 CE drew to a close, Zhang Jue faced increasing pressure from multiple imperial armies converging on his positions in Jizhu. The great leader of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of followers, now found his forces reduced to a hardcore of devoted believers surrounded by enemies. The physical and emotional strain of leading a failing revolution began to take its toll on Zhang Jue's health. According to historical records, he fell seriously ill during the autumn months, possibly from the stress of constant warfare and the weight of responsibility for his followers' lives. His illness created a crisis of leadership within the remaining rebel forces, as many had invested such faith in his supposed divine powers that they could not conceive of continuing without him. Zhang Jue attempted to maintain morale by claiming his sickness was another test from heaven, but doubt began to creep into even his most devoted disciples. As winter approached, it became clear that the man who had shaken the foundations of the Han Dynasty was dying, taking with him the dreams and hopes of millions who had believed in his promise of a better world. Zhang Jue died in late 184 CE, bringing an end to the prophetic career that had inspired the greatest peasant rebellion in Chinese history up to that time. His death occurred before imperial forces could capture him, denying the Han Dynasty the propaganda victory of executing the rebel leader publicly. However, his passing created an immediate crisis for the remaining Yellow Turban forces, as the movement had been so closely identified with his personal charisma and claimed divine mandate. Command of the main rebel army passed to Zhang Jue's surviving generals, but they lacked his religious authority and ability to inspire fanatical devotion among the troops. Imperial forces, learning of their enemy's death, pressed their advantage with renewed vigor. The final assault on the main Yellow Turban stronghold came in early 185 CE, when Imperial armies overwhelmed the demoralized rebels in a series of coordinated attacks. Without their prophet leader to promise divine intervention, many Yellow Turban warriors lost the will to fight. The organized phase of the Great Rebellion was finally coming to an end, though scattered insurgencies would continue for many years. The fall of the main Yellow Turban stronghold marked the end of the rebellion as an organized threat to imperial authority. But Zhang Bao continued resistance in his own territory for several more months. The youngest surviving brother had learned from his siblings' defeats and employed increasingly desperate tactics to avoid their fate. He fortified his remaining followers in mountain strongholds and launched suicide attacks against imperial positions, hoping to inflict enough casualties to force a negotiated settlement. However, his position became increasingly untenable as imperial forces surrounded his bases and cut off supply lines. In 185 CE, Zhang Bao was finally cornered and killed in battle, joining his brothers in death and ending the Zhang family's leadership of the Great Rebellion. With all three founding brothers dead, the Yellow Turban movement lost its central coordination and religious legitimacy. However, the ideas they had propagated and the social conditions that had sparked their uprising remained unchanged. Scattered groups of former rebels continued guerrilla warfare across multiple provinces, while new leaders emerged to carry on the struggle in different forms. Although the death of Zhang Bao in 185 CE ended the original Yellow Turban leadership, the rebellion had created conditions that would plague the Han Dynasty for decades to come. Scattered groups of former rebels, local bandits inspired by Yellow Turban ideology, and new religious movements continued to challenge imperial authority across the empire. The most significant of these successor movements emerged in the early 190s under leaders like Zhang Lu, who established an independent theocratic state in Hanzhong, and Yu Jai, who led uprisings in the eastern provinces. These later rebels often adopted Yellow Turban symbolism and religious practices, claiming to continue Zhang Jue's mission of bringing the Great Peace to China. The imperial government found itself fighting a seemingly endless series of local insurgencies, each requiring military resources that further drained the treasury and weakened central authority. More importantly, the emergency powers granted to regional governors and generals during the original rebellion had created a new class of independent warlords who were becoming increasingly autonomous from imperial control. The very measures taken to suppress the Yellow Turban Rebellion were inadvertently destroying the centralized system they had been designed to protect. The long-term consequences of the Yellow Turban Rebellion extended far beyond the immediate military conflict, fundamentally altering the trajectory of Chinese history. The massive military expenditures required to suppress the uprising had bankrupted the imperial treasury, while the destruction of agricultural regions created food shortages and economic instability. More critically, the emergency powers granted to regional commanders had created a new class of semi-independent warlords who increasingly ignored central authority. Figures like Zhang Jue, who had been elevated during the rebellion, would later march on the capital and effectively end imperial control over the military. The rebellion also demonstrated that the Han Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven in the eyes of millions of its subjects, creating a legitimacy crisis that could never be fully resolved. By 205 CE, the last remnants of organized Yellow Turban resistance were finally suppressed, but the damage to imperial authority was irreversible. Within a few years, the Han Dynasty would collapse entirely, ushering in the chaotic Three Kingdoms period. The peasant rebellion that had begun with Zhang Jue's promise of peace had instead brought centuries of warfare and political fragmentation. The Yellow Turban Rebellion stands as one of history's most significant peasant uprisings, demonstrating both the power of revolutionary faith and the ultimate limits of popular resistance against established authority. Zhang Jue and his brothers had created a movement that briefly united millions of oppressed farmers under a vision of social justice and spiritual renewal, challenging the fundamental assumptions of imperial governance. Although their rebellion ultimately failed to achieve its immediate goals, it succeeded in exposing the fatal weaknesses of the Han Dynasty and accelerating its eventual collapse. The uprising also established patterns of religious political resistance that would recur throughout Chinese history, inspiring later movements from the Red Turbans to the Taiping Rebellion. Modern historians recognize the Yellow Turban Rebellion as a watershed moment that marked the transition from the classical imperial system to the fragmented medieval period of Chinese history. The peasants who donned yellow headbands in 184 CE could never have imagined that their desperate revolt would reshape an entire civilization. But their courage and sacrifice became part of the eternal struggle between the powerful and the oppressed that defines human history. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.